kind of tension here, I think. So on one hand, we might want to kind of ensure that this, huge amounts of investment that are going into conservation and resourcing are basically going to areas of like greatest conservation value identified through SCP and similar approaches. But at the same time, SCP tends to be pretty much like relatively centrally coordinated and could be characterized as kind of top-down. So for example, governments and NGOs, as we saw in this example in Guyana, might coordinate an SCP process with when kind of planning how to expand area-based conservation to meet target 3. So on the other hand, there's this push that we mentioned before to kind of expand to more decentralized area-based conservation. So this would involve supporting conservation efforts by local actors, regardless of whether or not they occur in areas prioritized in SCP approaches. So I think there's a whole kind of bunch of potentially quite interesting questions at this intersection. So you might remember this slide that we looked at before when we were kind of talking about like the typical workflow in a SCP process. And one really crucial step is actually knowing the locations of existing conservation areas, which raises the question, are we actually adequately tracking non-state area-based measures so we can kind of account for these as part of existing conservation networks? So recent work by Siyu Chin and Yifan He and colleagues basically developed and tested a new empirically grounded approach to document area-based governance systems. So among, I think it was 9 Amazonian countries, they basically find that like 16% of terrestrial areas are under state designated PAs. So this is what would be reflected in like the WDPA, for instance. However, when using their more kind of comprehensive cataloging approach, they find that an additional 25% are under some other form of area-based conservation. So in total, this account suggests that 41%, not 16%, are under some form of area-based conservation. So I guess, like, in other words, existing systems are basically massively under accounting for the true extent of area-based conservation. So you can imagine a situation where, like, I don't know, failure to account for these existing areas, if you were following an SCP process, might mean that we end up trying to kind of like establish, say, a state nature reserve in a place that's actually already under management by some other type of actor, like an indigenous group, for example. So I guess, like, coming back to that first question that we posed, the answer looks like, actually, no, probably we're not really adequately tracking what's been done already. So I guess another question is, do we understand the drivers and the barriers to non-state actors engaging in area-based conservation, so we could potentially encourage their greater participation to help fill gaps, for instance? So we can kind of look back at this workflow again, and here we might have identified areas of potential conservation value, and we might say, okay, rather than trying to establish a protected area in this place, we might instead want to kind of promote community-led or bottom-up conservation efforts to help fill gaps in conservation networks. And I think there's clearly there's a lot of reasons why you shouldn't and can't impose community-based conservation approaches. So I guess this kind of raises the question, okay, how might we effectively and equitably support more grassroots conservation in these areas? And I guess this is a kind of question that collaborators and I kind of loosely clustered into this catalyzing conservation group have been working on from a couple of different angles. So, for example, we recently published work looking at why some farmers engage in forest restoration while others don't, among over 200,000 landowners in the Atlantic forest in Brazil. So this map just shows the municipalities where there's been some form of restoration in which these 200,000 landowners reside. And we find that farmers who engage in restoration had more cattle, they had larger land sizes, they were closer to cities, they were in areas with more people and roads, and they were also in wealthier municipalities or wealthy areas. So I guess on one hand, this suggests that restoration is actually happening in some of Brazil's most degraded areas, which I think is pretty positive. On the other hand, it suggests that smallholder farmers who actually collectively own really substantial areas of land are not necessarily adequately incentivized to engage in the restoration agenda. So I guess turning back to this second question, I think it's fair to say research is emerging that might help answer it, but I think we're still quite far away from being able to kind of answer it in a kind of comprehensive way. So I guess a kind of follow-up question that springs to mind from this is, okay, if target one is all about forward-looking planning, could we, in theory, use predictive science approaches to try and forecast where area-based measures are likely to emerge under different future scenarios? So are they likely to occur in places that are valuable for biodiversity, for instance? So we actually recently had a crack at this in Zambia. So we had using data on over 400,000 settlements, which are shown in orange, and the locations of community forestry indicated by the green, where we combined like big geospatial data and machine learning methods. I'm not going to go too much into the results, but I think the kind of short story is actually it's really hard. So this panel A shows the actual spatial distribution of engaged settlements in yellow. And this panel B shows which settlements were predicted to be engaged. And I think like overall, this predictive model was like generally pretty accurate. But there are lots of areas that were predicted to be engaged that actually weren't. So it's actually quite hard to tease out more kind of fine scale differences. And I think it's probably because we're actually missing really important data on a bunch of factors, most notably like preferences and priorities of local communities themselves. And really this lack of like data on local preferences is really, rarely actually available in big geospatial data sets. And it also presents actually a fundamental challenge in SCP as well. And I think it also gets to the heart of a much wider kind of ethical issue, the fact that we're not necessarily, or we may not be adequately centering local willingness or interest in conservation in spatial planning decisions. So I think the kind of answer to this final question is quite mixed. And it also raises the question, should we actually be attempting to do this? Okay, so I think this kind of gives a bit of a flavor of some of the questions that arise when thinking about like spatial planning beyond protected areas. I'm sure there are like many more that we could talk about maybe in the Q&A. And in fact, we're actually convening a workshop in Brisbane just before the upcoming ICCB conference, where we're exploring some of these questions in more detail. So I think we've got a few spaces left. So if anybody's available to join in person on Friday the 13th of June, then yeah, please get in touch. You could email Nuantika, who's kind of coordinating and leading the workshop, or Bob or me about that. So yeah, thank you.
That was great. Thank you, Tom. Sorry, it's been a while since I've used Zoom, so I can't find the clapping emoji, but that was great. Lovely. So I think we'll hand over to Sam. And yes, and in the meantime, as a reminder, as EJ's put in the chat, please, if you have any questions as we go along, please, please put your questions in the chat. Okay, Sam, are you?
Yep, is that sharing?
Yes, that's
okay,
great.
Good. Yeah, okay, thanks, Bob, and yeah, Tom, for introducing some of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about as well now. So I'm going to talk about some of my PhD research, which is kind of most directly relates to Target 2, which Bob mentioned earlier. So yeah, so as we kind of all know and has been mentioned before, we're dealing with biodiversity loss and kind of ecosystems around the globe that have been significantly altered and sort of degraded by human activity. And the scale and level of this degradation means there is a need to kind of scale up ecosystem restoration efforts. And that's kind of been reflected in Target 2, which Bob mentioned, around restoring at least 30% of ecosystems by 2030, and also by the fact that the UN have kind of labelled this the decade of ecosystem restoration. And so to do this, there is a need to kind of, in order to address the scale of the challenge, there's a need to think about different approaches to restoration. One approach that's kind of gained a lot of attention as an important and promising approach is rewilding, which seeks to restore natural, dynamic and self-sustaining ecosystems. Rewilding could kind of change the way that we approach restoration by reducing the need for human intervention, whilst simultaneously improving the resilience of ecosystems in the face of climate change and other pressures. However, in considering this approach, we also need to think about kind of potential trade-offs with other land uses. Chief among these is kind of food security and food production. So whilst rewilding could support agriculture, for instance, by restoring, increasing pollination, soil health, those kinds of things, It also requires large areas of land in order to restore the ecological processes needed for the approach. So this risks removing land from food production, which could reduce food security by increasing a nation's reliance on imports. But by removing land from production, we also risk displacing production to other potentially more biodiverse areas in what's kind of been termed a biodiversity leak. So as a result, in order to guide where we seek to rewild and the best areas for this that minimizes conflicts with other land uses such as food production, we need frameworks which can guide this, that prioritize where to work, are cost effective, so minimize the costs involved, that can identify and manage potential trade-offs with other land uses. And we also kind of might want to meet goals for specific species and habitats as well that have local, national or international importance alongside those that we might want to meet for rewilding. So SCP, as Tom and Bob have mentioned before, is particularly useful kind of framework for this. It's been widely used already to help create protected area networks, but also for other spatial conservation and restoration actions. A key parts of the process involves kind of identifying a set of goals, setting targets for these goals, and then identifying the best places to meet these targets whilst minimizing the overall cost. And that's kind of how you can account for opportunity costs for other land uses, say. So in sum, it's an efficient, repeatable, transparent and equitable process for informing conservation decisions. And it's an evidence-based approach which involves defining stakeholder priorities and translating that into maptions to inform action on the ground. So in terms of systematic conservation planning, it's usually divided into kind of 3 main stages. So kind of framing the problem, spatial prioritization, so looking at where to act, and then implementation follows this. In talking about how I might include rewilding within systematic conservation planning, I'm going to focus on spatial prioritization, which kind of broadly follows these 8 steps. So you start by defining your planning region. You identify the kind of features of conservation that you want to protect or restore. You divide your region into planning units. Then you measure the amount of each feature in each planning unit. After this, you then produce a cost value. So that's kind of maybe a missed opportunity cost for agriculture, for example. And that's how you can kind of minimize these costs and account for other land uses and trade-offs there. You set the status of each planning unit, and that enables you to kind of account for what's already being protected within existing sites as well, so acknowledging those contributions. And then you set targets for each feature, which ideally kind of are based on science and priorities of different stakeholders and that kind of thing. And then you identify the best place for meeting the targets whilst minimizing the cost. So focusing on step 7, which is a key part of the process, some people have questioned kind of how compatible rewilding might be with systematic conservation planning, particularly due to this step, so setting targets. And this is because rewilding focuses on natural processes rather than specific outcomes, and it's open-ended, so that makes it quite difficult to define or measure success towards. And because systematic conservation planning typically requires specific and measurable targets, some have argued that rewilding doesn't fit within the framework as a result. In addition, those unpredictable outcomes may conflict with the targets that you set for specific habitats or species if they fall within areas which are then managed passively, which adds another challenge as well. So that's what I sought to do with this chapter of my PhD, explore how we might do this. We looked at the UK, which represents a great case study for exploring how to tackle these challenges. The UK has lost much of its biodiversity, historic biodiversity, so restoration is quite urgent. However, that has to contend with competing demands on land, such as for housing, renewables and food security. And additionally, UK conservation has focused on specific habitats and species and managing these quite actively. So that could clash with rewilding's kind of dynamic process-led approach. And more specifically, in terms of our study region, we looked at Kent, and this is quite emblematic of some of these challenges. So it has nationally important biodiversity, but is also subject to multiple competing pressures on land. For instance, 70% of land is agriculture. So due to these challenges, it's kind of quite a good sort of testing ground to develop how we might incorporate rewilding into systematic conservation planning, which could then be applied in other contexts as well. So with our project, we sought to do 2 things. Firstly, demonstrate that you can integrate rewilding into systematic conservation planning, and do so alongside, while still meeting kind of targets that you might have for specific habitats or species as well. We also use systematic conservation planning to explore what those potential implications of a rewilding approach might be on food security and also on existing habitats as well. To answer aim 2, we kind of explore the implications of rewilding for food security. We use the UKCH Land Cover Plus map and also mapped vineyards and orchards within QGIS, as these are important within Kent. And then we use this to quantify the area of crops within areas selected for restoration and active restoration and free rewilding in our solution to kind of explore those potential impacts. And in terms of how to incorporate rewilding into systematic conservation planning, there were kind of 4 main questions that we needed to answer. So the first of these was kind of to ensure we still met our targets for specific habitats and species. And to do this, we had settled on 2 zones. So we had a conservation and active restoration zone, and here we had specific targets for specific habitats and species to ensure that locally important kind of biodiversity would persist. And then we also had a second rewilding zone, which had less prescriptive and broader goals associated with it. The second challenge was how to map areas suitable for rewilding. And to do this, we built on kind of methodologies such as one by Perino et al. Around kind of ecosystem, rewilding complex ecosystems and other work as well, to kind of identify a set of factors to map areas suitable for rewilding. This included kind of dispersal limiting infrastructure, environmental characteristics, and kind of human-wildlife conflict, that kind of thing. And we developed this closely with Kent Wildlife Trust, which is a conservation charity that we worked with on this project, in order to kind of produce outputs which could help guide landscape scale conservation, but also to demonstrate how systematic conservation planning might be used in the area. So working closely with them meant that we were able to ensure the map was accurate and also kind of match how rewilding would be approached in the region. And this produced the map on the right. So that's areas that would be suitable within Kent for rewilding. Our third challenge, and the one that has kind of been raised as sort of a barrier to incorporating rewilding into systematic conservation planning, is how to set targets for it. Targets are typically explicit and quantitative, so we can measure progress towards them. And for the specific habitats and species, we did this based on local extent and a series of factors, including importance to local projects and strategies. But for rewilding, because rewilding is open-ended, we instead settled on setting a broad kind of area-based target of 20% of that area that was identified in the previous mapping exercise. And we did this in combination with a high target for areas that were suitable for rewilding and also in bottlenecks for connectivity for habitats which were suitable for a rewilding approach. The fourth question was how to kind of ensure that we identify areas with a minimum area, which would then ensure self-sustaining ecosystems. This involved a multi-step process using MarkSan, which is a spatial prioritization software, often used in SCP, and MinPatch, which is a version of MarkSan, which enables you to secure a minimum patch size. I won't go into too much detail because that could be its whole own presentation, but if you have any questions either after this or following the webinar, please let me know. But in sum, we kind of carried out the process for the specific habitats and features first, identifying the best places for meeting these targets, running that through MinPatch as well. And then we did the same for the rewilding targets, and then ran that through MinPatch to ensure that the areas identified for rewilding had a minimum size of 100 hectares, which was agreed as part of the mapping exercise with Kent Wildlife Trust. So this led to our final map, where you can see that we've kind of identified areas for specific habitats and species, but we've also identified areas for rewilding that sort of complement these and kind of assist in increasing connectivity and things like that. This was about 39% of our study region, and about 58,000 hectares of that was existing designated sites. So in producing this map, we've shown that within systematic conservation planning, you can include a map of feature with broad, less prescriptive measure aims and set a target for it as well, enabling it to be included within the SCP process. And this kind of avoids introducing uncertainty in seeking to meet specific goals with passive management, whilst also, identifying areas for rewilding. This also enabled us to explore the implications of rewilding for food security and agriculture. So areas identified for rewilding contained areas of ancient broadleaf woodlands, which could act as seed sources for natural regeneration and support kind of the woodland mosaic, which the rewilding approach was aiming for. But rewilding is also unpredictable, so that might create potential tensions, particularly for habitats such as calcareous grasslands, which 26% of the area in Kent fell within the zone. And these require active management to maintain their value. So whilst rewilding reduces active management, some interventions may still be needed. And this was a key part of our process in identifying areas suitable. So we agreed with Kent Wildlife Trust that any areas that would be identified would be closely monitored to see how rewilding affects them. It also helped us to look at food security. So interestingly, areas for active restoration involve large areas of cereal crops, which are less kind of compatible with more pro-biodiversity friendly management practices. But on the other hand, areas identified for rewilding were more compatible with a low intensity agricultural approach, so areas of grass and other kind of lower value land. So this may have fewer conflicts with food production and also may be more compatible with approaches that might be more acceptable to farmers rather than removing land from production entirely. So just to quickly summarise, systematic conservation planning represents a powerful framework for planning rewilding and understanding trade-offs. However, as some of those implications highlight, there are some trade-offs between the kind of costs associated with active restoration and the reduced certainty of outcomes of rewilding. And so highlighting these trade-offs and kind of how the balance between passive and active management is determined in a transparent manner would be key to using SCP to inform rewilding in a planning region. And another point is just that systematic conservation planning can be iterative, so an adaptive management approach could be taken in future. So as your understanding of the outcomes of passive rewilding grows, you could then subsequently lower specific targets for specific features in subsequent iterations. So yeah, thanks for listening, and I'll hand back over to Bob.
Great, thank you very much, Sam. And again, my virtual applause, if I could find the button, would be following. So yeah, thank you. Those were two really nice talks that I've hopefully are interesting in terms of the really key issues that we think are at the heart of spatial planning, you know, coming out from what's happening for global biodiversity framework, but also national policies of trying to balance these different factors. Right, well, we've got several good questions already in the chat, which is brilliant, but I'm going to start first with some questions from the chair, which I think will touch on some of these elements that other people have asked as well. So my first question is, as you've both discussed, so much about spatial conservation planning assumes that a network is going to be designed and implemented by a central agency. But both your talks are about landscapes where change depends on engaging with individual landowners and communities. So do you have any ideas, suggestions on how to better incorporate those local level decisions, preferences, values into landscape scale spatial planning? Tom, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I can have a crack at that. Yeah, I mean, it's like obviously a really tough problem, right? I think it's like unrealistic that you'd be able to go out and just like census the entire population of an area and just be like, you know, are you interested in this particular model? Would you want to engage? All this kind of stuff like that. I don't know if that's, you know, like realistic. I guess two potential approaches kind of spring to mind, and one is the little bit more technical, and then one is the one which is, I don't know, the more involved process, but actually might be more useful. So I guess like to a certain extent, you know, you might try and look for proxies in terms of like people's willingness to engage with these models. So for example, like I think Natural England has this like spatially explicit database on agro-environmental scheme payments. So you could imagine a situation where like the density of payments or like the density of people, farmers who are, you know, like keen to engage in a certain model of conservation or restoration or something like that on their land, maybe that's used as a kind of initial proxy for interest. And then I guess the second possible solution really relates back to the fact that, like, I suppose we've been talking about SCP with quite a lot of focus on like the modeling component, but in general, I guess the ideal is that actually that modeling is embedded in a much wider participatory process. And I guess it's more like maybe those, you know, like the maps and stuff like that that are generated, rather than being treated as like a definitive plan, they're more like focal points for discussion, and you could talk about different scenarios with different stakeholders, and it's something which is, you know, there to kind of like help facilitate I don't know, yeah, like, yeah, more participatory landscape management, the governance processes. And I guess there's also the element which is around like, you know, can we actually try and leverage existing governance systems? So local level actors could actually like flag their interest. But I guess that requires like widespread awareness that there is a certain model that local actors can engage with or not. And then that model to actually be something which is like potentially very attractive to them. And then like the presence of those devolved governance systems where information could be kind of like fed up to higher levels. So like local leaders could register their interest with like the forest department or something, for example. So yeah, I don't know, like I'm gonna plead like a certain amount of ignorance, but
no, that's really nice. And Sam, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so in terms of the work that I've done is obviously predominantly a private ownership in terms of landowners in the area. So in terms of kind of thinking about how to better incorporate landowners in the decision, I think there is a need for, I guess, looking at different ways that the outputs of SCP can be used, like Tom said, but in terms of thinking about how you might, I guess, make use of opportunities as they arise. So that might be through just when willing landowners kind of come forward, taking into account their contributions in subsequent iterations of the planning process, but also in terms of kind of engaging with landowners. So kind of thinking about how you might use the outputs of SCP to do that, and kind of, yeah, what that land is contributing and how to use that as a sort of an engagement tool. So thinking about things around that. And kind of, yeah, maybe even thinking about how that could align with some of the tools that are used to kind of fund things, and kind of making decisions about whether to fund landowners, and kind of as well just in terms of, yeah, how contributions to targets, and yeah, all the different things that kind of you get from going through the systematic conservation planning process, and thinking of ways to, yeah, use that to better engage, and also acknowledge what people are doing already as well. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and so my second question is, which elements of your results do you think are most relevant for UK policymakers?
Yeah, yeah. So I think there are a couple of different things that are quite relevant. So I think firstly, just in terms of rewilding, so obviously interest in rewilding is high, but there's kind of a lot of variations in how it's defined, and also kind of how we might identify where opportunities for rewilding are within a region. So I think just demonstrating the use of systematic conservation planning could kind of be a potentially effective way to sort of develop that consensus, and also transparently define where those opportunities are. So just in terms of how you might leverage support or interest in rewilding, and kind of make sure you really clearly define and do so, and identify opportunities in a really transparent way, just using the framework, and kind of, yeah, being evidence-based and defensible and stuff. I think also just in terms of thinking about the implications for food security and food production, just in the UK, I think rewilding, because rewilding kind of exists on a kind of a continuum of human influence. I think highlighting how potentially rewilding could be integrated with some of those more low intensity agricultural kind of techniques and actions is quite useful, just to, in terms of, yeah, address kind of negative perceptions around rewilding, and how it might take land out of food production, kind of work out how rewilding might look within landscapes such as Kent as well.
Great, thank you. And Tom, sort of thinking more at the global scale based on your research. Oh, yeah, there we go. You're off mute. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, I'm kind of like hesitant to, in terms of a lot of the research that we've been doing so far, in terms of making global generalizations, I think I'm kind of hesitant to try and draw out policy implications at the moment, because I think with a lot of these questions, they're still at the kind of description before prescription point. So I think, like, I don't know, I think there's like a lot of questions that we probably still need to answer before we could kind of come up with like definitive recommendations, I think, based on the research that I've been doing. Yeah,
Sure,
that's a
sure.
cop-out, but...
No, well, you know, an academic who knows their limits is a thing to be cherished. Yeah, so maybe going on to the third question then, which is, if we're talking about participatory, integrated biodiversity, inclusive spatial planning, to use the jargon from Target 1, what are the barriers that, in the examples you've presented, to actually achieving that, to, you know, for it to be truly participatory and integrated? And what do you think could be done to overcome those barriers?
That's one where I'd be willing to have a crack at it. Yeah, I mean, like, I guess, you know, like, as we touched on a little bit before, like, these participatory processes, I mean, like, they're not unique to SCP, and we know that they can be really resource intensive and time intensive and technically challenging. So I guess, like, the kind of obvious barriers, which you could probably, you know, present as an example of barriers to like pretty much any conservation measure, is like funding and time and capacity. I guess there's also the element of, like, you know, there is a danger, or there is the kind of angle which is like, well, if we're talking about managing resources for the wider public good, then the downside of very participatory process is obviously like the NIMBYism, where people might just be like, you know what, like, even if it is at the expense of, like, you know, like wider public interest, we just don't want it in our back garden. So I guess that's like some of the more immediate answers. But I also think, like, there are models that have been used to facilitate participatory governance processes at scale in other sectors, and I think somebody might have mentioned, you know, like, like this when you're talking about like other contexts in terms of like cross-sectoral SCP. So I think, like, when I was trying to like look for examples of this, I think in the Netherlands they have these water boards, regional water authorities, and every couple of years, basically all members or all citizens in the Netherlands that are like registered with this on this system essentially have the opportunity to elect or to kind of like vote for representatives of these like 20 odd water boards that exist across the country. And you know, like, in theory, obviously this goes back to the point of like, yeah, resources and like prioritization, all that kind of stuff. You could imagine, or you could envisage like similar systems being developed for like integrated landscape management, I suppose. I mean, like, I guess one of the things that also springs to mind from that example is like surface water is something which is super salient in the Netherlands. So there's like strong incentives for citizens participation. It might be that actually there are lots of people in the UK like who aren't necessarily that interested in engaging in these participatory processes. So you might just have like particular interest groups that you know, prioritize your engagement. So I don't know. Yeah, I think we could probably look to other sectors.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think it's, as we're beginning to run out of time, I think it would be good to go through some of the questions that people have asked. So I'm just going to take the chair's prerogative to, there's a couple of things that I think I can answer just quickly in terms of sort of the technical side. So Jill Thompson asked about, when it comes to including cost in systematic conservation planning, is it just financial? And no, it can basically be anything that that the stakeholders think is important and that it's possible to map. So it could be management costs, it can be opportunity costs, it could be the inverse of willingness, a whole set of things that you can feed into the process to try and choose areas where, yeah, you're more likely to have more support because it's either less expensive, has fewer impacts, or there's more willingness. So that's one question. And oh, sorry, I'm trying to find the others. There was one other. Certainly someone was asking about, with climate change and global change, how can that fit into the system? And yeah, again, there's definitely scope within systematic conservation planning for having targets for features of the current distribution and future distribution. So again, if there's scope for modeling how things might change, then that can definitely be included. One question that I think we haven't really covered, from Chris Sambrook, and this is probably mostly for Sam, is how can passive rewilding, which happens without any specific intentional action, often due to rural land and abandonment, be factored into systematic conservation planning? Is it a starting assumption of SCP that rewilding is an active choice?
Yeah. Yeah, in terms of it being a starting assumption, I think, I mean, in terms of part of the process of SCP in this context was defining what rewilding looks like and how it should be approached. So I think there would be scope to maybe consider different versions of rewilding. In terms of, I know there's some work mapping kind of where might be abandoned, so that could potentially be incorporated. Yeah, I'm not sure if I fully understood.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
Yes, apologies. The questions are coming in thick and fast, which is brilliant. Just trying to see. So yes, I mean, lots of people asking about how you incorporate other forms of human nature relations and sort of more richer and sort of less technocratic elements. And again, apologies, we probably don't have time to really go into the weeds of that. It would be great to talk about all of this in more detail. So Valerie Nelson's talking about multi-method decision-making is an interesting process. So yes, I think that's one of the things that systematic conservation planning needs to do, is learn more about, from those other approaches and make sure that they're more broadly embedded. And yes, maybe Tom, a question for you. So James Williams is asking, spatial planning is broader than conservation. How do we get more consideration of what we want where when the planning process is piecemeal?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess this is probably one that, Bob, I don't know if you've encountered many examples where systematic conservation planning has been used, or like those types of approaches have been used for like wider integrated landscape management where conservation isn't necessarily the ultimate outcome.
Yeah, I mean, so I think marine is leading the way in terms of marine spatial planning is much more a sort of cross-sector approach. And because of that, SCP, I think, sort of has fitted quite nicely into that. And there's definitely more of a focus of looking at zoning and potentially some of the zoning not being related to conservation or restoration at all as a way of fitting that together. But I think, I mean, to me, implicitly, target one is looking at trying to bring biodiversity into existing processes rather than getting everyone else to start using our approaches. So again, I think it's probably a key element is the systematic conservation planning folk engaging with those broader sectors to make sure that we can play a role rather than trying to make everyone march to our drum.
I guess it also relates back to this previous point that I think we've all raised, which is like the need for the SCP modeling approach to be embedded in a much wider decision-making process, where you're engaging many more different sets of actors and stuff like that. But I don't know, like another question again, which is more for Bob and anybody else who's had experience with like SCP, is like, to what extent do those coordinating actors tend to just focus on that specific modeling component, and to what extent are they actually embedding it in these wider processes, and are resources, enough new resources being embedded to, or like directed to all of this other stuff that needs to go around it?
Yes, yeah, I mean, there are some great examples of achieving that. South Africa's done an amazing job. Gabon in the marine realm has done some really nice work as well. So yeah, there definitely are examples that we can learn from, but in most places, yeah, we're still quite a long way away from that. And that's, you know, that's something that we're interested in helping to bridge the gap as part of our Sharing Space for Nature project. Right, so thank you so much, everyone. I think we've got time to ask Tom and Sam in 30 seconds to say, what's the one key message that you'd like people to take away from hearing your talk? So Tom, as you're on screen at the moment, what would you say your key message is?
I guess it probably is actually the prioritization, pun intended, of all the kind of auxiliary and complementary different things that need to go around the SCP process to be able to make sure that it's actually, like, I don't know, effective and equitable and all that kind of stuff. So I guess that's making sure that you're doing all of that stuff as well as actually the modeling is probably the thing that I would say to policymakers.
Great, great. And Sam?
Yeah, I guess number one, that you can include rewilding within systematic conservation planning, but also that it's quite, yeah, can be quite a powerful tool to do so in quite a transparent and evidence-based way. And it's important to kind of, when you're doing restoration, to sort of, yeah, transparently show that balance between active and passive restoration approaches, and yeah, how that looks. So yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. So yes, as EJ's added in the comments, we'll be saving this chat, and we'll make sure that we respond to all of them. So thank you so much there's lots of really insightful comments and interesting questions, and we will definitely get back to you on all of them. So yes, thank you again for those great questions. Thanks to Sam and Tom for brilliant presentations, and I'm going to hand over to Hannah to give a little bit of sign off about what's coming up in the Cascade webinar series next.
Thank you, Bob. You can see my screen, yes?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And it's great, as Bob said, to see so many questions in the chat. So we will get back to you on those, and I will email responses from Bob and Sam and Tom to you at some point. So we are now webinar 5 out of 6 in this first Cascade webinar series. So we have just one remaining, which is at this time 2 weeks today. And the final webinar is going to zoom out slightly and think about the future of policy relevant research, particularly in the UK, but also internationally. So we are lucky to be joined by Sarah Chater, who is the co-chair of UPenn, which is the University Policy Engagement Network. And she's also based at UCL. And then we'll have quite a few members of the Cascade kind of core team thinking about lessons that we've learned through UPenn and Cascade and what the future of policy relevant research could look like. So do sign up and come and join us for that. And then finally, just again to say thank you so much for joining today. And if you're keen to stay engaged with us, feel free to follow us on social media, sign up to our newsletter, or just get in touch with me if you want to chat about anything. So have a great day and a great weekend, and thank you again.